So this weekend is all about the mind. Now, issues of the mind, you can get rid of that picture now if you want. Issues of the mind and mental health are one of the issues of our day. So it's not clear whether the number of cases of mental disorders is actually on the rise, or whether it's just that we're talking about these things more. But it sometimes feels like everywhere you turn, there's someone on social media sharing their story about poor mental health, or there's someone over here advocating for the rights of those who struggle in this area. And a lot of where we're at the moment in our society is a corrective to where we've come from, when issues of mental health held such stigma that they couldn't even be spoken of. So take, for example, the word bedlam, which many of you would understand to mean chaos or disorder. And that was the name of one of the original mental asylums from the 1400s. That was the impression of these places. So it's not uncommon for me to be at a kid's birthday party or a soft play, and somebody described the scene as bedlam, awful, uncontrollable. And it's why we used to say that people have gone round the bend, because these institutions used to quite literally be built around the corner so that no one could see them, and no one would have to suffer the indignity of even having to think that these sort of troubled people existed. And then books like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in the 1960s, which was turned into a film starring Jack Nicholson in the 1970s, perpetuated this idea that people struggling with mental health issues were total nutcases, loonies. Even when I was growing up, I remember the hushed tones, hearing that a neighbour had been sent to the loony bin. Mental health has always been an area that has frightened people because of the often unpredictable nature of the symptoms that people present. But mercifully, in this day and age, it's becoming less and less hidden. And I hope in our society that we're becoming gradually more accepting of where people are at, even if we don't understand it. And I don't think the church has always known how to handle people who struggle with mental health disorders. And I think that's gradually changing, but historically, the church in the West hasn't been comfortable handling negative emotions at all. But life contains many negative emotions, doesn't it? Life is hard. And life is particularly hard for those who struggle in the area of the mind. Hard, hard, hard. Now, I'd hazard a guess, as I look around this room, that every single one of you has either struggled with some sort of mental health issue or is struggling, and if not personally, then knows somebody who is. This is an inescapable topic for us to engage with, which is why it's so important that you guys have come away to Blackpool this weekend to chew some of these topics over. So let me show you a diagram that sort of demonstrates the sliding scale of mental disorders that we face in our society. So down there on the left, we have people who face such difficulty mentally that they're unable to function in everyday life. For their own safety, or maybe for the safety of others, these people are probably hospitalized. They might be psychotic or schizophrenic and need multiple drugs and intervention to have any kind of semblance of functioning or routine. That's a really tricky place to be, and some of you will have been there, or will know people who have. And then up at this end on the right, we have people who have never had any reason to question their mental stability. Having rational thoughts and emotional equilibrium hasn't been a challenge for you at this point in your life so far. You look at the people down at the other end and you feel really grateful not to be in their shoes. And then in between this, we have everything else in between, to greater or lesser extents of severity. Anxiety, depression, bipolar, personality disorders, eating disorders, OCD, to name but a few. You may or may not have sought medical help, but find that these conditions are the backdrop to your very existence. Perhaps consider just for a moment where you would place yourself on this scale. Are you nearer the end that struggles to get through the day? Or maybe you see yourself towards this end and you're feeling okay. Do you feel happy to be where you've placed yourself? Where would you like to be on this scale? Where do you think the best place to be is? And we'll come back to that diagram later on. But where I want to start us off this morning is by taking a giant step back. Because the place I want to go to is actually to ask the question of what does it mean to be human? What is a human being, and where does the mind fit into that? Does anyone know the answer to that? Like I'm genuinely interested. No? Well, neither do I. And that's part of the problem, isn't it? There is something fundamentally unknowable about a human being. So philosophers, scientists, psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, theologists, no, that's not right. Psychiatrists, economists have all made it their life's work to study this species called humanity, to try and make sense. And some people have concluded that we are rational, reasonable animals. It's as simple as that, and it's all about our capacity for making decisions. Other schools of thought will say that we're just a sack of chemicals, a bunch of neurons that's been determined by years of conditioning. There's no reason. We're at the mercy of where we've come from. And then you'll have the view that embraces the romanticism of all that is a mystery. Just express yourself. Be free to go wherever your imagination takes you. Our culture feeds us all sorts of truths about what it means to be human. And often these truths are seemingly contradictory, but we sort of swallow them anyway and live in response to these differing worldviews, often without realizing it. So at any one time, there are 3 million pieces of information available to us about what's going on, about reality over there on the left. Now, we as humans can't cope with that amount of information, and so we filter out the vast majority of it. Some stuff we just ignore, some things we distort, and then we generalize whatever is left, until there are only about 60 pieces of information for us to consider at any one point. But my point from this diagram is this, that to be human means to be limited in our perspective. To be human means to be limited in our perspective. And this is my first big question to you this weekend. If you accept the fact that we as humans are limited in our perspective, who are you going to trust to inform you about what reality actually is, about what it actually means to be human? Because people are trying to inform us all the time. Don't be so naive not to realize that the influence our culture has on us is massive, but so insidious, so familiar to us, that we don't even recognize it for what it is. Now, for some of you sat there, your mind will immediately think, God. I'll trust in God. I'll look to the Bible to tell me about what it means to be human. But others of you, I'm sure, won't be convinced. Some of you aren't even sure that God exists, much less that he has anything compelling to say to you about the state of humanity. I mean, surely something written, 5,000 years ago hasn't got anything to say to us about the issues that we face in the year 2018. I'm pretty sure that Moses didn't stress about likes on Instagram. But here's the thing. How about, just for the time being, we consider what the Bible, this ancient text, reveals to us about what it means to be human, and see for yourself if what it says makes any sense to you about the way that you experience life. And that's what I'm hoping to do over these 2 talks today, is to describe to you a biblical worldview for understanding the mind and mental health, to give you confidence that what this says about the issues that you face is not only credible, but really, really beautiful, and certainly worth giving our attention to. Okay, so first of all, who can remember the song that was my intro song when I came on the stage? Did anyone pick it up? I can just hear some mumblings. Anyone shout it out? Human by Rag and Bone Man. I love that song. Especially the chorus, which doesn't really work when you say it in a polite English accent. But what he says is, I'm only human after all. I'm only human after all. Don't put the blame on me. Don't put the blame on me. And implicit to that is an idea that is everywhere. That to be human is to be fallible. To be human is to be capable of letting people down. So I miss my good friend's birthday and I put my hands in the air and say, don't blame me, I'm only human. As though my very humanity is the reason that I let her down. And in a sense this morning, I want to reclaim what that word human means in our understanding and in our imagination. Because you see, to be human is actually a very good thing. Take a look sometime at Genesis 1-3, because you'll see there that when God had had a busy day of creating, he'd get to the end of the day and he'd look at the sea and the sky and he'd say, it's good. He'd look at the animals and he'd say, that's good. And when he made humans, he looked at what he'd created and he said, that's very good. At that time, in those early Eden days, the world was at peace. And by peace, I don't mean a sort of panpipe music sort of peace. I mean the peace that comes when everything fits together as it should. When the teeth of the cogs align perfectly and the wheels of the earth and humanity and God smoothly turn. This fitting together, this integration, was called shalom, peace. And it's actually quite difficult to imagine. But it was perfection. There was no friction or dis-ease or disease. There was no disharmony. Negative thoughts did not exist. I mean, can you begin to imagine that? Adam and Eve wouldn't bicker. There weren't emotional wounds. They needed each other. They needed God. But they didn't fight against that. That wasn't seen as a weakness. All the cogs smoothly turning with ease. I mean, do you not just think that's beautiful? That that's what your heart longs for? Man was at perfect peace with himself, with his companion, with God, and with all of creation. That is what it means to be human. And one day, when there's a new heaven and a new earth, that will be our experience of being human again. But for now, we're living with the consequences of man trying to do things his own way. You see, when Adam and Eve ate of the apple on the tree, what they were actually saying was, I'm just not sure, God, that I trust you. I'm just going to try this thing out over here just to double check that it's not offering something better than you are. And the results were catastrophic. The perfect integration of man with himself, with God, with his companion and the earth was gone. And where there was integration in these areas, now there was disintegration, separation, fragmentation. The cogs no longer turn in sync. They clunk and bash against each other. This fragmentation, this separation impacted our relationship with God, where we're separated by sin, and our relationship with the physical earth, where we work and toil, and our interactions with other people, where pride and self-centeredness damage every relationship. Now, once I found our 7-year-old Anna crying in her bed, and when I asked her what was wrong, she said, "But why? Why did Eve have to eat the apple?" Her young heart, as yet uninfluenced by rationalism and clever ideas, instinctively mourns for what we have lost. When our next-door neighbor died, Anna, not so numbed to the brutal reality of death as we are, was indignant, her childlike spirit crying, "It's not supposed to be like this." As adults, we forget sometimes, don't we, that death, disease, tears, and pain were never what God intended. We were created for a world more beautiful than this one. But of course, we are physically decaying. So I'm rapidly approaching 40, which people tell me, Bernard, is still very, very young. But sometimes I'll walk past a mirror and catch sight of my face and be like, "What's happened?" As though somebody has put one of those rubber masks on my face that people wear in films to make them look older. Only my mask actually seems to be my face. But our physical decay is a lot more serious, isn't it, than just grey hair and wrinkles. We get ill and we die. And notably for this weekend, this disintegration has also led to an internal separation within self. We are psychologically broken, wounded. We're insecure. We've lost control over our passions, and there is so much shame. Look at conditions like anorexia nervosa or any form of self-harm. The profound separation between the internal man and their physical body leads someone to cause damage to themselves, even to the point of death. It's an absolute tragedy. This is not the way it was meant to be. But the reason I've outlined all that to you is to describe to you the experience of being human that we all share, whether you're looking at it from a biblical worldview or not. Now, secular commentators wouldn't recognize this state as being a consequence of the fall, but they would all resonate with that feeling somewhere inside that things just don't always fit together as they should. The cogs grate. Whether you're a Christian or not, we're all responding to the same human condition, even if our ideas of what we're going to do to get us out of this mess vary dramatically. But I wonder now if we could turn our thoughts more specifically to the internal thoughts of man and think about where the mind is and where that fits in. Now, throughout the centuries, philosophers and theologians have studied the ancient text that we call the Old Testament to try and glean from the original Hebrew language just what comprises a human being. I mean, it's obvious that we have a physical body. Most people agree on that. But when it comes to describing the immaterial part of ourself, the part of ourself that we cannot see, it gets a bit more complicated. It gets a little trickier. So suffice to say, there is a great deal that remains mysterious about what it means to be human. But what you do get from the Old Testament are broad brushstrokes to describe the internal workings of man, which I'll describe with you now. So we have two parts. The material part, which is our physical encasing, over here on the right, and the immaterial part, which the Old Testament uses words like heart or soul or spirit to describe, often interchangeably. And for today, we're going to use slime to help us think about this immaterial part of ourself. Now, do you guys realize that slime's like totally a massive deal nowadays? Anyone know that? For a certain sector of society. For school-aged kids, they're all obsessed with making slime because it's so stretchy, it's so fun. People have made like whole careers out of making slime and then putting those videos on YouTube. It's incredible. Anyway, so Elsa, our middle daughter, has spent months and months trying to perfect the perfect slime recipe for you all to enjoy here this weekend. But we have spectacularly failed. It's much trickier. We spent a small fortune, but we have failed to make adequate slime. But on your table, you have some little pots of some fake slime, which isn't quite as fun to play with, but was much easier to make for your enjoyment. And this slime, this fake slime, is to help us today to think about our immaterial self. So go on, take a pot. This is for you to play with. So this slime represents the part of ourself that we cannot see. Yeah, it's still quite fun. It's not nice. Yeah, there was one batch early on that got burnt. So I think that's the colour that Colin's got. So the sort of slightly odd-looking colour, it's got some burnt fragments in it. But this filled our half-term last week, so we're very grateful. So the word that the Old Testament uses most regularly to describe this immaterial self, the part of ourself that we cannot see, is the Hebrew word leb, which is translated as heart. Now, when we think about heart, what springs to mind? Yeah, we think about feelings. We think about emotional people. We think about soft toys and a tilting of the head. But the Hebrews had rather a different way of understanding the heart. To them, the heart was the very core of who we are. So in Proverbs 4:23, it says, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." And in different places, this Hebrew word for heart, leb, is used to describe where we feel emotions, where we make decisions, where we plan things or remember things, where we think about things. The heart is the very core of man. Now, we all are strongly influenced by Greek Western thought, and so have a strong inclination culturally to separate out these different parts of a human being. So the heart is down here, and it can't really be trusted because it's so changeable. The will floats about up here, affecting everything we do, and the mind is up here. We have thoughts up here, we make decisions up here. This is where our consciousness is. And as we have separated these parts out, we've also elevated the mind to being the key control box, the puppet master, so to speak, of who we are. So as Descartes once famously said, "I think therefore I am. In many ways, our rationality defines us, which is why having a mental health condition is so stigmatized in our society, because we've got a very high view of the mind. But in Hebraic thought, as we can see, a slightly different picture is being painted. A united whole, not separated into these different parts with separate functions, but rather we are one whole. All these parts of ourselves, our will, our emotions, and our mind are inseparable from the other because they are one thing, the heart of what it means to be man. But what difference does that make? What difference in our actual day-to-day life does it make if we see ourselves as one whole rather than these segmented parts? Well, for a start, we can't really use the phrase mental health because that doesn't make sense. We can't talk about our mental health or our mind on its own. Our mental health can't be separated from our emotional health, our physical health, and our will, because we are a being. So using this picture, the mind isn't a separate thing to consider all by itself. So the other day, one of my daughters was trying to get something working, like a Bluetooth connection or something, and it just wasn't working, and she was really frustrated. And I'm totally rubbish at this sort of thing, admittedly, but she was getting more and more cross, louder and louder, really hard work. And I was like, I didn't know what to do. And then all of a sudden, she turned and she shouted in my face, "Why is my finger hurting so much?" She'd bitten her nail down too far, and the nail bed was aching. When we turned our joint attention to this nagging pain, suddenly the frustration about the Bluetooth connection disappeared. We often have nagging pains in the background of our consciousness that we don't give very much attention to. But these things affect us, every part of us, more than we realize. If you're having trouble getting on with your flatmate, the strain of that will impact every part of your life, your attitude to your work, your mood, your physical body, your other relationships. If you break your ankle, it will affect every part of your life. If you're struggling with debt, it will in some way affect every part of your life, whether you're aware of it or not. Because we are whole beings, and we can't compartmentalize ourselves even if we want to. But why do we want to? Why do we want to separate things out? We want to because we like to think that if there's a problem over here in this small part of me, then I can do something to fix it. If I get a headache, I'll take a paracetamol and the problem will be gone. Now, as a side note, there's a very real danger in our society of viewing antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication in the same sort of ways we do paracetamol, as a quick fix. Now, none of the GPs that I know would advocate the prescription of medication on its own without some sort of therapy to go alongside. But first of all, resources in the NHS are stretched, and sometimes there just isn't the funding to offer CBT or counselling. But then secondly, even when there are the resources available, the reality is that some people choose to rely on medication alone. Now, I'm not anti-medication at all, but we functionally rely on these pills more than is healthy. These pills are not a quick fix. There are no quick fixes when it comes to mental health. Because as you'll understand from the example of the headache isn't the cause of the pain. The headache is an alarm bell signaling that something isn't right inside. You could take as much paracetamol as you want, but you would never think that the paracetamol was curing the problem. It's just taking away the pain, which is a legitimate reason to take it. But if the pain continues, you know that further investigation is necessary. And the same is true for our mental health. Many of the diagnoses made, especially those towards the less severe end, where the line between health and ill health is more blurry. So I'm not talking about things like schizophrenia, for example, but especially towards this end, many of the diagnoses describe the symptoms of the condition rather than the cause. These problems that we face with low mood or obsessive thoughts are alarm bells. They're warning signals that something somewhere isn't right. The cogs aren't turning smoothly. And we often feel the effects of our internal immaterial ill health in our physical bodies. Now, the term psychosomatic illness is no longer used by psychiatrists because it contains so much stigma. The term is now medically unexplained physical symptoms, but it's the same sort of idea, that in response to stress or anxiety, some people would experience headaches, or severe bowel pain, or a whole host of other miserable physical ailments to varying degrees of severity. The pain or discomfort that these people experience is real. They're not making it up. But in our incredible humanity, their physical, material body is signaling clanging alarm bells that something isn't right inside, in their heart, in their internal, immaterial self. However much we try and compartmentalize ourselves, that's just not the way it works. We respond to life and our experience with our whole self, whether we want to or not. Proverbs 14, verse 30 says, "A heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones." And in the place of envy, you could quite easily put stress, or bitterness, or worry. Our physical bodies are rotting with these emotional realities without us even being aware of it. And there is nothing new under the sun. Sadness, depression, isolation, conflicting thoughts, anger, fatigue have been the experience common to man since these days, long before we use the term mental health. You only have to flick through the Psalms to see the despair and raw emotion of the writers. "Why are you so downcast, O my soul? All night long I flooded my bed with tears. How long must I wrestle with my thoughts?" But why, in face of the difficulties in life, do some of us cross over the line into mental ill health, whereas some of us stay well? And that's a really big question. But what I want to share with you before we finish this session is how psychiatry understands the factors involved in people becoming ill. Now, a psychiatrist friend of mine shared this with me, and the reason I share it now is partly because it's really helpful, but partly because I want to show you that the very best of what secular experts have come up with is only deepened and expanded when we consider it in light of a biblical worldview. Does that make sense? That a biblical worldview of the fracturing and disintegration of humanity isn't set against humanistic thought, but takes the best of it and makes more sense of it. So, what are the factors that are involved in determining whether we become ill? So the first are the predisposing factors. And these are the factors that make it more likely that we will at some point struggle with our mental health. Now, psychiatrists have come up with this word mashup, biopsychosocial, because they want to reiterate the complexity of this, that it's a combination of these things that affect our vulnerability. As it is with physical illness also, it's multifactorial. But in this broad category, it includes our genetic predisposition. Now, it's not the case that there's a schizophrenia gene or something like that. Our genes don't determine our mental illness, but they might tip the balance in a certain way. Or equally, there could be underlying physical conditions, such as a thyroid condition, for example. And then we have the psychosocial part, and this includes our early upbringing and development, whether we suffered deprivation or poor attachment with our primary caregivers. Much of our experience of the brutal reality of this fragmented world comes at a very young age, before we can make any sense of it, where we learn that people aren't always kind. When we have our first taste of shame and we begin to rely on ourselves. These narratives that we form internally at a young age are very, very powerful. And all of us in this room are vulnerable, wherever you place yourself on that scale. And then we have the precipitating factors. And these precipitating factors are whatever tips you over the edge into mental illness. So that could be a particular trauma or a loss or a stressful life event. So, for example, a friend of ours who lost their mother sunk into a depression that didn't lift for a number of years. This guy was already vulnerable because of his predisposing factors, and this loss tipped him over the edge. These precipitating factors are sometimes big things and sometimes really small things, like having a car breakdown or something. And then the perpetuating factors are whatever is preventing you from returning to health. And so you find yourself mentally unwell. The perpetuating factors are the things that are keeping you in that place, preventing recovery. So, for example, a friend of ours suffered from postpartum psychosis, which was triggered by an extended period of sleep deprivation. A perpetuating factor in her persisting in ill health was her continuing inability to sleep. Without sleep, there was no possibility that she would become well. So a perpetuating factor could be staying in an abusive relationship, or it could be continuing in unhealthy lifestyles or behavior. And then finally, there are the protective factors. And these are the patterns of behavior or thought that protect us from a reoccurrence of mental ill health or from it occurring in the first place. So for me, for example, exercise will be a protective factor that I employ in order to remain mentally healthy. I don't go for a run because I particularly care about being fit or healthy. I go for a run because I come back, as Phil describes, somehow more human. Yeah, more at peace. The cogs seem to turn more smoothly. So these protective factors can include all sorts of things, but as a broad idea, these things will all involve moving towards integration in these areas that have been broken. So in exercise, I'm integrating my immaterial self with my material self. And the exertion feels really good for my physical body. But I'm also enjoying the earth. I run outside and feel the healthiness of the connection with creation. I enjoy the hills. I see the birds and I smell the fumes. There really is no simplistic formula to being mentally healthy. It doesn't work like that. And what works for me won't be the same as what works for you. But part of what I hope we can begin to do this weekend is have conversations with each other where we can share from our experiences the times that we have felt most human, most whole. Because you'll notice that by the time we're here in Blackpool this weekend, there's not an awful lot that we can do about the predisposing factors, because it's all happened already. And there's not an awful lot that we can do about the precipitating factors, because we just don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. But the perpetuating factors and the protective factors are both areas that we can do something about. You might always live with a tendency towards anxiety. I might always live with a tendency towards anger. But as we begin to pay attention to these parts of ourselves, we can begin to learn how to live well in the midst of these tendencies. And that's what we're going to look at this afternoon when we come back, as we begin to imagine what reintegration in all these areas looks like. But if just as I end, I wonder if we could have the first slide back that we looked at. Remember where you placed yourself on this scale, this arbitrary scale of mental well-being. Well, here's the thing. Wherever you placed yourself on this scale, the reality is, as we've heard, is that we are all fragmented. None of us here today enjoys and uses your mind in the way that God intended. All of us, however coherent we think we are broken, disconnected, and fragile. So the diagram might better look like this. With mental wholeness down at this end, millions of miles from where any of us are. And that's humbling for those of us who like to think of ourselves as mentally okay. And that's encouraging for those of us who are all too aware of our mental fragility. I mean, that's not great news, is it? But the really, really good news is that we're not left on our own to sort ourselves out. Yes, we can think about wise ways of living and do our best to stay mentally well. But ultimately, and this is what we're going to go on to this afternoon, we are not the answer to our own problems. We can't sort ourselves out just by trying hard. But we can start by recognizing the invitation that God is extending to us to trust Him. He wants to make us more human, more whole. And He promises that He's going to give us all the power that we need to do that. We can't sort out the mess of our broken, fractured humanity. But there is real hope for freedom and flourishing, for enjoyment of our mind and mental capacities even in the midst of their brokenness. Amen.